When we think of the Axis powers in World War II, almost all of the attention goes to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It's easy to forget that Italy was also fighting for the Axis, and that is for one very simple reason. They were really pretty hopeless. When fighting on their own, the Italians had very few successes, winning nothing of any real significance. At one point, they tried to invade Greece and weren't even able to overcome that very small and badly equipped military. Italy didn't even make it to the end of the war. Once Allied forces were threatening the Italian mainland in 1943, Italy switched sides and joined the Allies. So why did Italy perform so badly? What went wrong with the Italian military that made it so much less effective than Germany or Japan? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions. But before that, let's have a quick overview of what happened. The story of Italy in World War II. Before that, I'd like to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, Extra Wallets. Extra makes sleek aluminium card holders that can hold up to 12 cards. Their simple, slim design looks great and is perfect for easily slipping into your front or back pocket. They have a mechanism that allows you to push a button and all of your cards will fan out, making it easy to get the one that you need. One of Extra's most useful products is their Finder GPS card, which lets you track down your wallet if you misplace it. You can ring it from your phone, see where it is on a map, and even receive separation alerts. The Finder GPS card also works with the Apple Find My app. With its stylish packaging, I think an Extra wallet is a great gift for that person who you never know what to buy for. One of the reasons that I'm happy to promote Extra is that they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you don't like the wallet, you can get your money back, no questions asked. Right now, you can use the link in the description to get 30% off during Extra's Labor Day sale. Use code HenryStewart at checkout for even more savings. In the 1930s, Italy was under the control of right-wing dictator Benito Mussolini. He came to power in 1922 as head of the Fascist Party. Over the next few years, Mussolini made himself dictator, removing all restraints on his power and building a police state. Mussolini dreamed of making Italy a powerful country that dominated the Mediterranean, recreating something similar to the old Roman Empire. Throughout his reign, he would launch several invasions in an attempt to expand Italy's borders. The first came in 1935 when he ordered an invasion of Ethiopia. After 2 years, Italy managed to defeat the Ethiopian forces and occupy the country. Italy also got involved in another conflict that was going on at the time, the Spanish Civil War. That began when right-wing generals of the Spanish armed forces tried to topple the left-wing government in a military coup. However, much of the country rejected the coup and it ended up splitting the Spanish military and territory in half. Rather than seizing power, the coup plotters had inadvertently started the Spanish Civil War. For 3 years, Spain was embroiled in violence in what has been described as a dress rehearsal for World War II. Italy got heavily involved in the conflict, sending an enormous amount of equipment and about 70,000 men to help the right-wing faction. The Italian help played a decisive role in the Civil War, and in April of 1939, the right-wing nationalists won control of Spain. Mussolini then turned his attention to empire building again when he invaded Albania. In only 5 days, the Italian army overwhelmed the small Albanian military, and the king was forced to go into exile in Greece. The next month, Italy agreed to an alliance with Nazi Germany known as the Pact of Steel. The pact was more than just a defensive alliance. It stipulated that each country had to go to war against any that the other attacked. In theory, they were to coordinate their military plans, but Hitler immediately broke the agreement by attacking Poland without first discussing it with Mussolini. The outbreak of the war wasn't good news for Italy, as it was totally underprepared. In fact, Mussolini actually told Hitler that Italy wouldn't be ready for war until 1943, 4 years away. Nevertheless, Italy pretty much had to get involved in the war to avoid being seen as weak and getting taken advantage of by Germany. In the end, Italy's first foray into World War II was actually extremely easy. On May 10th, 1940, Germany invaded France, and within weeks it was clear that it was very soon going to conquer the country. Once it was obvious that France was going to collapse, Mussolini ordered that Italy get involved in the action, launching an invasion across the Alps. Eventually, unable to resist the German onslaught, France agreed to a peace deal in which it was partitioned between a German-occupied north and a puppet state in the south. Italy was also given a small amount of French territory. Throughout the summer of 1940, Italy got involved in engagements all over the place, stretching itself very thin. First, in August, it invaded British Somaliland and was able to drive the British out of the area. Then, in September, Italy invaded British Egypt, again with some success, managing to take some territory along the coast. However, Mussolini had much bigger plans than just the north of Africa. To really dominate the Mediterranean, he wanted to conquer Greece. In October, Italy launched an invasion and immediately it ran into problems. First, the weather was extremely cold, giving many men frostbite and hampering their logistics. Second, the Greeks fought extremely fiercely to defend their territory. In the end, the Greeks were actually able to push the Italians back across the border and the war became a stalemate. While the Italian military was totally underperforming in Greece, it was also getting badly humiliated by the British in Egypt. In December of 1940, the British launched an offensive against the Italians and were able to push them back into Libya. The British had only about 36,000 men against 150,000 Italians, but with better equipment, training and leadership, they were able to outmaneuver the Italians. The British were able to take almost all the Italians prisoner, about 130,000 men, while they suffered only about 2,000 casualties. As the Italians were getting outclassed on land, they were also losing control of the sea. Italy lost two major naval battles, which cost it dominance over the Mediterranean. The picture was looking just as bad in East Africa. The British launched a counterattack in British Somaliland and were able to occupy it. They then pushed west into Italian East Africa and were able to take Addis Ababa, the modern-day capital of Ethiopia. A few months later, the last of the Italian forces in East Africa would surrender. In June of 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union and Italy sent about 300,000 men to aid with the invasion. Many of those men would die or be taken prisoner at the famously bloody Battle of Stalingrad. In North Africa, the Italians were now getting help from Germany, and for a while it did make a significant difference. In May of 1942, the German-Italian forces managed to win a decisive victory in Libya, killing, wounding or capturing about 50,000 Allied men and suffering only about 3,000 casualties themselves. That was despite the fact that the Allies had more men and almost twice as many tanks. Churchill later wrote of the battle that it was one of the heaviest blows that he could recall from the war. For that victory, Hitler rewarded the German commander Rommel with a promotion to the rank of Field Marshal, making him the youngest ever man to achieve that rank. After that stunning victory, the German-Italian forces pushed east, making it as far as El Alamein in Egypt. There they met the Allies in two battles, and in the second battle of El Alamein, the Allies decisively defeated the German-Italian forces. For the next few months, the Allies continued to press their advantage and advance west into Libya. Eventually, in May of 1943, the last of the Italian and German troops in Africa surrendered. Having taken Africa, the Allies then focused their attention on an invasion of Italy. The idea of invading Europe through Italy was heavily pushed by Churchill, who famously called it the Axis' soft underbelly. In July of 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily, and within a month they had occupied the island. With Italian territory coming under direct threat of Allied occupation, the higher-ups in the Italian government began to lose faith in the war effort and in Prime Minister Mussolini. On the 25th of July, Mussolini was ousted in a vote of no confidence, ending 21 years of fascist rule in Italy. The king then appointed Pietro Badoglio as Prime Minister, who entered into negotiations with the Allies. Under Badoglio, Italy would switch sides and join the Allies against Germany. With that, Italy's role as a major Axis nation had ended. The Italian military had performed extremely badly, having been of little aid to Hitler and Nazi Germany. So, why was Italy so bad? What explains its lack of effectiveness? The first thing to mention is that when war broke out, Italy was totally underprepared. In fact, Mussolini himself acknowledged that. In April of 1939, he sent a memo to Hitler admitting that the Italian military was in serious need of rearmament and by his estimate would only be ready for war in 1943 at the earliest. One of the biggest problems was a serious lack of modern equipment. The Italian military simply didn't have all the gear that it needed. That was in large part due to Italy's military-industrial complex being much smaller than that of the other nations. Italy didn't have a large industrial sector in the late 1930s. Less than a third of its workforce was in industry. Contrast that with Germany, where 42% of the workforce was in the industrial sector. That meant that Italy's industrial output was much smaller. In fact, it was similar to where Germany's had been about 40 years earlier. Here is a chart of total industrial output of various nations at the start of the war. As you can see, Italy was the lowest of all the major countries. The numbers are as a percentage of British industrial output in 1900, so Italy had an output of about half of what Britain had had 40 years earlier. Another big reason that Italy couldn't produce enough military equipment was corruption, with a lot of the money sent to arms companies getting effectively stolen. The companies would collude in cartels and use deception to defraud the government. They also had a trump card, which was the threat of strikes or labour unrest. The big industrial fat cats had so much power that they could essentially hold the government hostage, threatening to stop production if they didn't get what they wanted. The military was basically forced to place large orders for overpriced, ineffective weapon systems for fear that if they didn't, they would end up with no weapons at all. Another problem was that the Italian culture was suspicious of modernity, and that included manufacturing processes. While other nations had long implemented mass production to make as many weapons as cheaply as possible, Italian weapons were much more handcrafted by small groups of workers. That made production much slower and it dramatically increased costs. For example, Italian battleships cost about twice as much as comparable battleships built by the French. As you can imagine, that failure of Italy's military-industrial complex led to it not producing anywhere near as much equipment as was needed. Italy was actually way behind the other nations before the war even started, and the picture got worse and worse as the years went on. For example, in 1939, Italy had less than a quarter as many motor vehicles as the other major powers. When you take into account the population size, the difference was even more stark. Italy had about 11 vehicles for every 1,000 people, compared with 25 for Germany and over 50 for Britain and France. That trend continued throughout the war, with Italy producing far less than other countries. For example, between 1940 and 1943, Italy produced about 10,000 aircraft, compared with Germany, which produced 60,000, and the USA, which produced a whopping 157,000. When it comes to tanks, the situation was very similar. Italy produced only about 4,000 armoured vehicles, of which only about 500 had a decent-sized gun. Germany produced about 19,000 comparable vehicles, while America produced about 58,000. To put it another way, America produced about 100 tanks for every one that Italy produced. That lack of production was made even worse by the fact that Italy started the war with less equipment than it should have, because it had sent so much to Spain during the Spanish Civil War. It sent 660 planes, 10,000 machine guns and 240,000 rifles, spending the equivalent of the Italian armed forces' entire annual budget. Overall, Italy didn't have anywhere near as much equipment as it needed to effectively fight World War II. Another problem was that much of the equipment that it did have was absolutely terrible. Most of it was extremely outdated and effectively useless on the battlefield. Perhaps the best example of that is the tank that Italy used more than any other during the war, the Carro Veloce 35, also called the L3. The L3 was totally inadequate for modern warfare. Its armour was very thin. In fact, it was so thin that it could actually be pierced by machine gun fire. In the words of Italian commander Italo Balbo, "Our light tanks, already old and armed only with machine guns, are completely outclassed. The machine guns of the British armoured cars pepper them with bullets and easily pierce their armour." Another big problem for the L3 was that it couldn't be fitted with a big, powerful gun. It was only big enough to be armed with machine guns, anti-tank rifles or flamethrowers. Another very mediocre Italian tank was the Fiat M13, Italy's main medium tank. The M13 was very unreliable and its armour was terrible. The steel was poor quality with a lot of impurities and it was riveted rather than welded. That meant that when it took a direct hit, it would shatter like glass, killing everyone inside. Italian tanks also had other problems, like the fact that they lacked radios, making them unable to work together effectively and coordinate their movements. The Italians did have some good equipment, but they didn't have enough of it. For example, their fighter plane, the RE 2005 Sagittario, was one of the best of the war. In the words of one British flying ace, it was altogether a superb, potent aeroplane. However, its good design counted for nothing because only 48 were produced. Overall, throughout the whole war, Italy's equipment situation was terrible. It had the least effective, least numerous, and most overpriced equipment of any nation during the war. Another major problem for Italy was a lack of unity. It was internally divided. The best example of that is simply that Mussolini didn't have absolute power. In Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia, it was one man that ultimately made all the decisions. In Italy, on the other hand, Mussolini was serving at the pleasure of the king and the senior generals. They had the power to get rid of him if they wanted to. A good example of Mussolini's lack of power was in 1925 when he chose Antonio Di Giorgio to be his war minister. Di Giorgio was unpopular with the military establishment, so there was a backlash and Mussolini was forced to fire him. As you can see, Mussolini didn't even have the power to put in place the war minister that he wanted. The whole time there was tons of political infighting that massively hindered the Italian war effort. For example, Mussolini was always concerned about rivals emerging who might oust him. One such rival was Pietro Badoglio, the chief of staff, who was very popular with the other generals. Mussolini was suspicious of the popularity of Badoglio and did everything he could to undermine his authority. Eventually, Mussolini made a scapegoat out of him, blaming him for Italy's failures in Greece and forcing him to resign. Badoglio himself was no better and had been working to undermine the general that was running the Africa campaign. That sort of feuding was typical of the Italian generals throughout the war. They were constantly sabotaging one another and stabbing each other in the back. What they really needed was for Mussolini at the top to take supreme command and bring about some cohesion, but given that he didn't have much military expertise himself, Mussolini was completely unqualified. He was forced to delegate control of the military to his scheming generals. As you can imagine, all that was a disaster for the Italian war effort. One of the biggest problems was it meant that there was no chance of getting the various branches of the military cooperating well. For example, the Air Force was determined not to be involved in supporting infantry operations because they felt that would imply that they were subordinate to the army. In the end, the three branches of the Italian military effectively fought separate campaigns. That was a big problem because World War II was so much about combining different branches of the military to compensate for each one's weaknesses. Another major issue for the Italian military was that it was poorly commanded, and that could be seen at all levels. For example, at the very top, the overall war aims were far too ambitious. Essentially, given that Italy's capacity was extremely limited, it tried to do far too much. If it had focused on just a few key objectives, then it might have had some success, but in the end it spread itself very thin and achieved little. At the height of the war, Italy was fighting in Greece, North Africa, East Africa, and in Russia as part of Operation Barbarossa. That was simply beyond the scope of the Italian military. On the battlefield itself, much of the command was also extremely incompetent. One example of that was the first engagement with the British in Egypt. The Italians had a mixed force of infantry, artillery, and 16 of the quite weak L3 tankettes that I mentioned earlier. Rather than using the force as a combined arms team, the Italian commander set them up as a defensive square that slightly resembled something out of the Battle of Waterloo. He placed his 4 artillery pieces on each corner of the square, the infantry formed the sides of the square, and the L3 light tanks surrounded it. Then, when the battle started, the L3s charged ahead, far away from the infantry and artillery. Isolated and without infantry support, they were quickly destroyed by the British, who had 2 medium tanks. With the L3s destroyed, the British could then easily advance and surround the infantry and artillery that was still in the square formation. The Italian infantry didn't have any anti-tank ammunition and so were pretty much defenceless against the British force and were quickly routed. That poor strategy by the Italian commander was completely different to the military doctrine that he had been taught, which correctly called for infantry and armour to be used in combination. Another good example of poor command was later in the war when the Italians had advanced into Egypt when the British were counterattacking. That counterattack was called Operation Compass and saw 36,000 British troops defeat an Italian force of about 150,000, around 5 times its size. The Italian commander recognized that his lack of vehicles meant that it would be easy for him to get outmaneuvered by the British force. His strategy was to dig in and fortify specific locations from which they would fight. However, those Italian positions were spread extremely thin over the vast desert, meaning that the British force could encircle and destroy a single one before moving on to the next. In the end, because only a small part of the Italian force was fighting at any one time, their superiority in numbers counted for nothing. With that crushing defeat, the Italian position in North Africa was perilously vulnerable, and so Hitler actually sent a force of 30,000 men to reinforce it. Under German leadership, the Italian troops fought much more effectively. For example, in May of 1942, they managed to win a decisive victory in Libya, killing, wounding or capturing about 50,000 Allied men and suffering only about 3,000 casualties themselves. That was despite the fact that the Allies had more men and almost twice as many tanks. Of the 90,000 Axis troops that fought the battle, about 2/3 of them were Italian and half the tanks, which shows that with better command they could fight well. The German commander was Erwin Rommel, and he actually complimented the Italian men, saying that they had performed well under his leadership. In conclusion, there are many reasons that the Italian military performed badly in World War II, but for me it can be summarized fairly well by saying that it was poorly equipped and poorly led. The fact that Italy produced only a tiny fraction of the number of tanks and planes, as for instance Germany, meant that it was never going to be able to really pull its weight. That said, the difference between how the Italian troops performed in North Africa under Italian leadership versus under German leadership is striking. In Operation Compass, just before the Germans took command, they had one of their worst losses. Under Rommel, at the Battle of Gazala, they had one of their greatest successes. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.